It was a quiet morning when everything changed. I had just finished my breakfast and was sitting at my desk when a soft chime echoed through the air. I had been expecting something, but not this. Not today. The doorbell rang, but there was no one on the doorstep. Instead, there was a sleek, futuristic vessel hovering just outside my window, casting a soft, pulsating light. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. A metallic, smooth shape with shimmering lights dancing across its surface. I froze, unsure of what to do, and my heart raced in anticipation. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. The alien maids were here. The treaty had been signed years ago, long before I was born. Earth had entered a pact with an advanced alien race, and part of the agreement was that 2 of their finest servants would be sent to Earth to serve humans for a limited period. The treaty was clear. They would work for us, and in return, we would share knowledge and resources. It was a deal that had worked for centuries. I had been chosen to be their recipient. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly, unsure of what to expect. This was not something that could be prepared for. There had been no training, no briefing. All I knew was that the 2 alien maids would be arriving today, and it was my responsibility to ensure they were comfortable and fulfilled their duties. As the spaceship's door slowly opened, I found myself holding my breath. 2 figures emerged, tall and graceful, stepping out onto the platform just outside my front door. One was pale and blonde. The other had lavender-colored hair that shimmered like the twilight sky. Their features were perfect, their eyes large and bright with an otherworldly glow. They were unlike anything I had ever imagined. They moved with a calmness that was both serene and unsettling. The blonde-haired maid stepped forward first. She was the more imposing of the 2, with a sharp, almost regal presence. Her skin had a soft, pearly glow, and her piercing blue eyes seemed to take in everything around her with an intensity that made me feel small. The other maid, with the lavender hair, had a gentler aura. Her violet eyes seemed to hold a depth of wisdom beyond her years, and though she was equally beautiful, her gentleness was apparent in the way she moved. They didn't speak at first, merely standing in front of me, waiting for some kind of instruction. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. These beings were not like the people I knew. They were from another world, and now they were in my home, under my care. I fumbled with my words, unsure of what to say. "Welcome," I finally managed. I am honored to have you here." The blonde maid nodded slightly, her eyes narrowing as though she was evaluating me. "We are here to serve," she said, her voice calm but firm. It was not a question, but a statement. She was not asking for permission. She was simply stating her purpose. The lavender-haired maid, who had been silent up until now, spoke next. "It is our duty," she said, her voice soft and melodic, but there was a strange note of sadness in it. She turned her head, as if considering something in the distance. "We do not choose our paths, we follow them." I was taken aback by her words. I had expected them to be more formal, more like servants fulfilling their duties without question. But this was different. This was something deeper, something more profound. The way she spoke hinted at something more than just service. It suggested a longing, a desire for something more. As I led them inside, I couldn't help but notice the odd sense of discomfort that filled the room. They moved gracefully as though they were used to places much more grand than my modest home. I had prepared the space for them, of course, making sure everything was clean and ready for their arrival. But somehow it felt inadequate. They were from another world, and I couldn't help but feel like I was trying to match their elegance and otherworldliness with mere human comforts. The alien maids did not seem to notice my unease. They were calm, collected, and unruffled by the simplicity of the surroundings. They were beings of unimaginable power and sophistication, yet they seemed perfectly at home here, as if they had been living among humans for ages. They had an air of quiet authority, as if they were used to being in charge. The day passed in a blur of routine. The maids did as instructed, preparing food, cleaning, and organizing the house with efficiency that left me both amazed and intimidated. They didn't need to be told twice. They had an intuitive understanding of how things should be done, a silent coordination between them that was almost unnerving. It was as if they had known what was needed before I even asked. But something was off. Though they did their tasks perfectly, there was an undeniable tension in the air. It was subtle at first, but I could feel it, an undercurrent of something unspoken. The maids never seemed fully content, their eyes often drifting to the window, as though they were watching something far beyond this small house. That night, as I sat in my living room, I caught a glimpse of the lavender-haired maid. She was standing by the window, her eyes gazing out into the distance, her expression unreadable. I hesitated before approaching her, unsure of what to say. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes that I couldn't explain. It was as though she longed for something more than this life of servitude. I decided to ask her what was on my mind. "Are you happy here?" I asked, unsure of the question's weight. She turned to me, her violet eyes locking with mine. For a moment I thought she might not answer, but then she spoke, her voice soft and distant. "We are here because we must be," she said, almost as though she was speaking to herself. "But that does not mean we are content." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. I had been so focused on fulfilling the terms of the treaty, ensuring the maids were well taken care of, that I hadn't considered the possibility that they might want more. They weren't just here to serve, they were here because they had been sent. But were they truly content with their role? As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but wonder, what did they really want? And what would happen if they decided they no longer wanted to serve? As the days passed, the alien maids settled into their routines, but there was something different in the air now. It wasn't just the normal, quiet hum of everyday life. It was a quiet rebellion that had started to grow, like a seed planted in the dark, slowly taking root. At first, it was barely noticeable. The blonde maid, whose name I had learned was Arya, was always efficient, moving with grace and precision as she completed her tasks. Her eyes never strayed far from her work, but there was an intensity behind them, as if she was constantly watching, analyzing everything. The lavender-haired maid, Lyra, was quieter, more reserved, but I couldn't help but feel that she was watching me too. Sometimes when I would enter a room, I'd find her gazing out of the window, lost in thought. It wasn't long before I noticed the small changes. Lyra would no longer respond immediately when I asked her to do something. At 2, first it was just a slight delay, a brief pause before she would go to work. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she was tired, or perhaps she had too much on her mind. But then it started happening more often. Arya, on the other hand, had become even more distant. While she still performed her duties with precision, there was a noticeable coldness in her demeanor. I couldn't help but feel that the bond we once had, the trust that had been established between us, was beginning to fray. It was as if a wall was slowly being built between us, and I had no idea why. One evening, as I sat at the dining table working through some paperwork, I noticed Lyra standing in the hallway, staring at the floor. I called her name, and she looked up, her violet eyes meeting mine. There was a flicker of something in them, something that felt almost foreign. It wasn't just weariness. It was something deeper, something more complex. "Yes?" she asked softly. "You've been quiet lately," I said, trying to sound casual. "Is everything all right?" She hesitated, her gaze shifting toward the window. For a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer, but then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We are not meant to be here forever," she said, almost to herself. "This is not our life." Her words struck me like a bolt of lightning. It was the first time she had said anything so direct, so filled with meaning. I had always assumed that they were here to serve, that they understood their role in the grand scheme of things. But now, hearing Lyra speak, I began to wonder if there was more to their presence than I had ever realized. What do you mean? I asked, leaning forward slightly. You're here because of the treaty, right? You agreed to it. Lyra didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite understand. Agreed? She murmured, almost as if she was questioning the word itself. But agreeing doesn't mean we accept it, not fully. Her words hung in the air like a fog, and I felt a sense of unease creeping into my chest. Was this some kind of rebellion? I couldn't tell. They had always been so obedient, so quiet in their service. But now, with every passing day, the subtle shifts were becoming harder to ignore. That night after dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the silence in my home heavier than usual. I had always believed that things were simple, that the maids had come to serve, and I had to ensure they were treated well. But now the balance had shifted. They were no longer just guests fulfilling a role. They were becoming something else, something that I wasn't prepared for. The next day, as I went about my usual routine, I caught sight of Arya standing in front of the window, her arms crossed over her chest. She was looking out at the world beyond, her expression unreadable. I approached her cautiously, unsure of how to address the growing tension. Arya, I began, trying to sound calm. Is everything all right? She turned her head slowly to face me. Her eyes were colder now, more distant. It was like the warmth that had once been there was gone, replaced by something sharper, more guarded. I'm fine, she said, her voice almost mechanical. Just thinking. I didn't believe her. I could see it in her eyes, the quiet rebellion that was beginning to simmer beneath the surface. She wasn't content, and neither was Lyra. They had come here to serve, but now they were starting to question that very purpose. That afternoon, as I was preparing lunch, I overheard them speaking to each other in hushed tones. It was impossible to understand exactly what they were saying, but their voices were filled with an intensity that made my heart race. There was an energy in the air, something that felt like it was building, like a storm on the horizon. Do you think he'll ever understand? Lyra's voice asked. No, Arya replied sharply. He won't, but it doesn't matter. We don't need his understanding. We need our freedom. I felt a chill run down my spine as I heard those words. Freedom. They wanted freedom. It was clear now. The quiet rebellion that had started as a mere whisper was now growing louder, stronger. These alien maids who had once been so obedient were beginning to question everything. And soon, they would demand what they felt they were entitled to. Couldn't help but wonder how far they would go. Would they leave? Would they challenge me, the treaty, everything that had been set in motion? The idea of losing them, of watching them walk away, was terrifying, but at the same time it was inevitable. They were not here to serve forever. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been blind to the truth for far too long. The days that followed were filled with an air of unease. The quiet rebellion that had begun as subtle shifts in behavior was now growing into something more tangible. Lyra and Arya had made it clear. They wanted freedom. The question that lingered in my mind was no longer whether they would demand it, but how I would handle it when the inevitable confrontation came. It wasn't just about the tasks anymore. They were no longer performing their duties with the same diligence they once had. Every request I made seemed to be met with hesitation, or worse, a silent refusal. Arya, once the picture of grace and efficiency, now performed her tasks with mechanical precision, her movements stiff and almost unwilling. Lyra, on the other hand, had taken to wandering the house at odd hours, her eyes distant and unfocused, as if lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with me or the work I had given her. It all came to a head one night, as I sat in the living room trying to catch up on some paperwork. The house was quieter than usual, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of the maids moving about. I looked up to find Arya standing in the doorway, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp and intense. Can I help you with something? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving mine. There was something in the air, something that crackled with tension. This was no longer a simple disagreement over chores or tasks. It was a power struggle, one that neither of us had expected, but one that had become inevitable. "We need to talk," Arya said, her voice colder than I had ever heard it before. There was no warmth, no politeness, only a quiet command that sent a chill through my spine. I set my pen down, looking at her, and motioned for her to sit. "What is it, Arya?" I asked cautiously. She hesitated before sitting down, her eyes now hard and unyielding. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think we're here because we have no choice, but that's not true. We came because we were sent, but now we want something different. We don't want to be your servants anymore." I felt a surge of confusion, followed by a wave of frustration. "But the treaty was never meant to keep us bound like this," she interrupted sharply. "It was meant to help us both, to create balance. But we are not your slaves. We never were." Her words struck a nerve. I had always thought of them as part of a deal, an arrangement that was fair and beneficial for both sides. But now I saw the cracks in that belief. They weren't just performing a duty, they were living a life they didn't want. And I had to ask myself if I was okay with that. I stood up, feeling a strange sense of powerlessness. "So what do you want then? What are you asking from me?" Lyra, who had been standing silently in the corner of the room, stepped forward. Her voice was softer than Arya's, but no less determined. "We want freedom," she said simply. "Freedom to choose what we do, to make our own decisions. We were never meant to be bound to a life of servitude." Her words echoed in my mind as I processed them. The situation was clear now. This wasn't just about rebellion. It was about identity, autonomy, and the right to choose one's own path. These alien beings who had once been so obedient were now seeking something I could not give them. They wanted to break free from the very system that had brought them here. I looked at both of them, my mind racing. How had it come to this? I had never intended to keep them under my control. I had treated them with respect, given them freedom within my home, but now it was clear that they saw their situation differently. "You were sent to serve," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You agreed to the terms of the treaty. What is it that you want from me now?" "We don't want your permission to live freely," Arya replied. "We want you to understand that we are not just tools to be used. We have our own desires, our own will. We want to leave." The realization hit me like a wave. They didn't just want to be treated like equals. They wanted their own lives, their own futures. And I was standing in the way of that. A silence stretched between us, thick with tension. I wanted to argue, to fight back against their demands. I had never thought of them as anything other than guests, albeit guests who had been sent to serve. But as I looked into their eyes, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Desperation. "I can't just let you go," I said, my voice strained. "What happens to the treaty? What happens to everything we've worked for?" "We don't care about the treaty anymore," Lyra said softly. "What matters now is our freedom. We can't live like this any longer." Their words were like a challenge, and I was caught between the desire to honor the deal and the knowledge that their freedom was not something I could control. This wasn't just a rebellion over chores or duties. It was a fight for autonomy, a fight for the right to choose. And I wasn't sure if I could stop it. The room felt smaller now, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I had always thought I was in control, but now I realized that they were the ones with the power to choose their own path, and the power to break free from everything that had brought them here. For the first time since they arrived, I felt a sense of helplessness. I wasn't the one with the answers anymore, they were. "You don't have to do this," I said quietly. "I can help you. I can make things better." But Arya just shook her head. "It's too late for that. We've made our decision." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of their demands. Lyra followed her, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve, and in that moment, I knew that things had changed forever. The power struggle was no longer about me commanding them. It was about them choosing their own future. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to let them go. The days that followed felt like they dragged on endlessly, the silence in the house now almost deafening. The alien maids, Lyra and Aria, had made their choice clear, and there was nothing more to be said between us. They were no longer the servants I had welcomed into my home. They were something else, something stronger, something more determined. Their rebellion had grown into a force I couldn't ignore, and as the days wore on, I found myself caught in a struggle that I hadn't anticipated. What had started as a simple request for freedom had now become an ultimatum. They no longer wanted to serve. They wanted to live. And in the face of their resolve, I found myself at a crossroads, unsure of what to do. I spent sleepless nights thinking about the treaty, about the promises that had been made, and about the consequences of breaking it. The idea of letting them go, of giving them the freedom they so desperately sought, was terrifying. What would it mean for humanity's relationship with the alien race? What would become of the treaty? And more importantly, what would become of my own life? The alien maids were not just guests in my home. They were part of something larger. They had come as part of an agreement, one that involved more than just serving me. Their presence was a symbol of the pact between two worlds. I had never thought that one simple request for freedom could unravel everything. It was late one evening when I found myself standing at the threshold of the living room, watching them as they moved about the house. Lyra was in the kitchen, carefully, preparing a meal, her movements slow and deliberate. Aria was sitting on the couch, staring out the window, her gaze distant and thoughtful. Both of them had that same quiet intensity, the same look of determination that had been growing in them for days. I stood there for a moment, watching them, and then I walked over to them. This was it, the moment when everything would be decided. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the anxiety that churned inside me. Lyra turned her head, her violet eyes meeting mine. Aria, who had been silent until then, looked up as well. There was no warmth in their expressions anymore, only a kind of solemn resolve. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began. "About wanting freedom. I understand your feelings, but this is not just about you two. This treaty, it's not just between us, it involves both our worlds." "We know," Aria replied, her voice calm but firm. "But this treaty was made when we had no choice. Now we are choosing for ourselves. We are not your property. We are not bound to serve." There it was, the harsh truth. They didn't want to be treated as mere tools. They wanted to be free, and their desire was not just a whim. It was a fundamental part of who they were. This wasn't just about breaking a contract. It was about breaking free from a life they had never chosen. The weight of their words hung in the air, suffocating me. I felt the conflict boiling inside me. But there was one question I couldn't escape. What would happen if I let them go? What would happen if I agreed to their demand for freedom? I turned to Lyra, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could get through to her. "Lyra, you've been here for so long, you've seen what we've done together. Do you really think it's worth throwing it all away?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lowered her gaze as if considering my words. But when she looked up again, I saw something different in her eyes. It wasn't just determination. It was a quiet sadness, a knowing look that told me she had already made up her mind. "We don't want to throw it away," she said softly, "but we cannot live like this anymore. You must understand, this is not a life we can keep living." Aria nodded in agreement. "We've seen what it's like to live with freedom, to make our own choices, and we can't go back to being what we once were." The finality of their words hit me like a slap. It wasn't just a request anymore, it was a declaration. They had decided, and nothing I said could change that. But as I looked at them, at their quiet resolve, their unwavering desire for freedom, I realized something. They were right. How could I deny them their freedom? How could I justify holding them against their will when all they wanted was the right to live their own lives? But the weight of the decision was still there. Could I really let them go? Could I break the treaty, risk everything, and watch them walk away? In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. This wasn't just about me. It was about two beings who had been brought here against their will, bound by an agreement that no longer made sense. And it was about a world that wasn't ready to let go of its power. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. "If I let you go, what happens to the treaty? What happens to us?" "Nothing happens," Arya replied. "We are not the end of this agreement. You have your own path to follow and we have ours. But we cannot stay here, living this life. We have to make our own choices." Lyra stepped forward, her gaze soft but resolute. "It's time for us to live freely. We'll find our own way just as you will." The finality in their words struck me hard. It was clear. They had made their decision, and so had I. I nodded slowly, my heart heavy with the weight of what I was about to do. "Then, go. Live your life. Find your freedom." Arya and Lyra exchanged a brief glance, and then, with one last look at me, they turned and walked toward the door. The sound of their footsteps was the only thing I could hear, each step echoing in my mind. And as they left, I realized something profound. In setting them free, I had freed myself as well. I had given up control, let go of the treaty, and allowed them to find their own path. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was the right thing. In that moment, I understood. Freedom was never something to be given or taken. It was something to be earned, something to be fought for. And both Lyra and Arya had fought for it. And in doing so, they had taught me a lesson I would never forget. The house was silent again, but this time it felt different. I was no longer their master, and they were no longer my servants. We were free.